He didn't die in battle, not on a horse, not on a throne. He died in a bed, sweating, moaning, covered in his own shit. King John of England, a man who ruled a kingdom, commanded armies, signed one of history's most important documents. And yet, when death came for him, it didn't look like a night. It looked like diarrhea. I know, it sounds funny, but that's the first reaction. The second is, wait, how does a king end up like that? Where were his doctors, his knights, his family? How does someone with that much power die that, helplessly? That's what we're here to find out, because this isn't just a gross medieval story. It's a breakdown of a man, of a monarchy, of a myth. And maybe, just maybe, the most terrifying part of his death wasn't the pain, it was the silence. If you think this is just a medieval horror story, you're wrong. This is about how power fails, how fear isolates, and how a man can lose everything before his body even gives up. He was born into royalty, but royalty never really wanted him. John came into the world in 1166 as the fifth son of King Henry II and Elena of Aquitaine. By then, the line of succession was already crowded. The firstborn, Henry the young king, was already crowned. The second, Richard, would become the Lionheart. The third, Geoffrey, had his own dukedom. John, he got a nickname, Lackland. No land, no inheritance, no role. He wasn't the heir. He wasn't even the spare. That's not just a name, it's a sentence. In a royal family, obsessed with legacy and bloodlines, being extra meant one thing. You exist until someone important needs you not to, and John knew it. He grew up watching his older brothers command armies, win respect, claim power. Meanwhile, he was passed around between castles, used as a bargaining chip in family politics, promised to titles that never came. That kind of childhood doesn't build confidence, it builds paranoia. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. One by one, his brothers died. Henry of illness, Geoffrey in a tournament, and Richard from a crossbow wound in France. And just like that, the boy who had nothing became King of England, not because he earned it, but because everyone else was dead. John's rise wasn't a triumph, it was an accident, and everyone around him knew it. The barons didn't respect him, the church didn't trust him. Even his own mother, Elena, one of the most powerful women in Europe, kept her distance. And John, he ruled like someone afraid the throne might vanish at any moment. Because, in his mind, maybe it always would. That fear bled into everything he did. He taxed brutally, imprisoned arbitrarily, punished nobles for the smallest offenses, and when France came knocking, he lost land after land. Not because he was outmatched, because he couldn't trust anyone to fight for him, and maybe they didn't. By 1215, he was cornered, forced to sign the Magna Carta, a document that said, for the first time, that a king was not above the law. And he hated it. He signed it anyway, then immediately tried to break it. So when people talk about King John, they talk about failure, about loss, about weakness, but I see something else. A man who was never meant to hold power, trying to control a world that never wanted him in it. And that kind of tension doesn't just shape policy, it erodes the soul, and soon it would start to eat away at his body. It wasn't a battlefield, it wasn't betrayal, it was dinner. That's how the end began. Not with blood, but with food. October 1216, John was on campaign again, dragging his army across the English countryside, in a final, desperate push to keep his crumbling kingdom intact. He had just crossed the Wash, a marshy, treacherous estuary known for swallowing carts, men, and horses alike. He lost his baggage train there, his crown, his treasure, gone beneath the mud, but worse was waiting. At a small monastery in Newark, he sat down to a meal, Peaches, cider, too sweet, too warm, too much. It doesn't matter exactly what it was. Dysentery, poisoned fruit, contaminated water, we'll never be sure. What we know is this. That night, the King of England began to shit himself to death. And here's the thing, we laugh, because the image is grotesque, absurd. A king on a golden throne, reduced to a man soiling a mattress. But if you slow down and really look at it, it's terrifying because this wasn't sudden. It wasn't merciful. It was slow, sticky, and inescapable. His body didn't betray him all at once. It peeled away control, inch by inch, hour by hour. First came the cramping, then the heat, then the loss of control. He couldn't hold food, then he couldn't hold water, then he couldn't hold anything. And around him, no battlefield, no court. Just a cold monastery room filled with the stench of sickness and silence. No priest reciting scripture. No generals waiting for orders. Only a few attendants watching their king rot from the inside. The tragedy here isn't just physical, it's spiritual. This was a man who had spent his entire reign commanding others, controlling fates, manipulating enemies. And now, he couldn't even control his own bowels. He groaned, he sweated. He tried to speak, but the only sound that filled the room was liquid hitting linen. And yet he kept giving orders, send messages, secure the ports, hold the barons back, as if speaking commands would stop the fever, as if ruling could delay the rot. But this time, no one listened, not because they couldn't, because they didn't want to. The barons had left him, the church had turned away, even his own family was nowhere near. The king was alone, alive, and dissolving. When I first read about this moment, I kept thinking this wasn't just the start of his death. This was the collapse of his illusion, the idea that power can protect you, that being king means being safe. That fear can keep people close. It doesn't. It just keeps them quiet. There's no dignity in dying like this. But worse, there was no one left to pretend there was. The fever didn't break. The vomiting got worse. His bowels emptied faster than his doctors could clean him. And yes, he had doctors. But this was 1216. Medicine meant prayers, hot knives, and mixing herbs that did nothing but mask the stench. They tried everything, bleeding, burning incense, even whispering Latin over his chest like spells, but nothing could stop it. His body kept dissolving, and so did everything that made him king. His attendants couldn't keep up. They changed his sheets again and again, until the linens ran out and they used cloaks. They wiped his mouth when he puked. But they didn't look him in the eyes. They bowed, but only out of habit, not respect. Here was a man, once feared by nobles, and now he couldn't stand, couldn't speak clearly, couldn't even sit up without help. That's not just physical breakdown, it's symbolic. The crown may still be his, but the posture of a king was gone. He no longer looked like power, he looked like punishment. And the mind followed. He began muttering, slipping between English and Latin, calling names no one in the room recognized. His brothers, his mother, old enemies, dead advisors. No one answered, because none of them were there. No one came, even in his delirium. He must have realized what that meant. I kept wondering, did he feel abandoned, or did he finally understand why he was? This wasn't a cursed illness. It wasn't bad luck. It was the sum total of a lifetime spent alienating everyone who could have stood by him. And then came the smell, the kind that clings to stone walls, the kind that makes grown men gag, the kind that signals not just sickness, but decay. They say the monastery reeked for weeks after he died, but by then, he wasn't done dying. He was still there in that bed, half conscious, half skin fully broken. He didn't die like a king, he died like a warning. By now, his bed wasn't a bed, it was a battlefield. The sheets were soaked, not with blood but with bile. His voice was gone, his skin grey, his stomach bloated from infection, then sunken from dehydration. Every breath was a struggle, every minute a humiliation. But the worst part was that people had stopped pretending to care. The room was full, but no one came closer. They stood at the edges, quiet, still, avoiding eye contact, avoiding responsibility. You could smell the fear, not of disease, but of proximity. They bowed, yes, but they didn't kneel. They answered, but they didn't listen. No prayers, no tears, no goodbyes, just the sound of a king dying, and no one asking him to stop. John was slipping in and out of consciousness. He called for his son, Henry, a child barely 9 years old, too far away, too scared, too late. He asked for a priest. One came, murmured last rites, more out of protocol than belief. No one thought he would be saved, not by medicine, not by God. This was the final performance, and everyone knew their role. The attendants, quiet, efficient, the nobles, distant, calculating, the church, present but uninvolved. No one fought over the bed, no one clung to the sheets, no one wept. Why would they? This wasn't a ruler passing on a legacy. It was a failure, collapsing in on itself. And John knew. He may have been delirious, but not blind. He saw the distance in their eyes, the hesitation in their steps, the relief behind their silence. And what do you do when the kingdom you ruled can't even pretend to mourn you? That's when something shifted. The man who had spent a lifetime issuing orders now whispered things no one could quite hear. Confessions, delusions, or maybe just apologies. That came decades too late. Either way, they were ignored, because in that room, there was only one thing people were waiting for: the moment he stopped breathing. They say a king's death is a state affair. John's was a whisper. And then a cleanup. His body was stripped, his clothes burned. His stench remained in the stone for weeks. There was no grand procession, no national mourning, just a funeral, quick, quiet, out of sight. And what haunted me most was this: there was no final surge, no last speech, no moment of redemption. He didn't say, "Forgive me." He didn't say anything. He just faded. The room around him had grown colder, not because of the stone walls, but because of what they reflected back. A man no longer seen as someone worth saving. Attendants moved like shadows, quiet, efficient, uninvested. They cleaned him, not out of kindness, but necessity. They kept him warm, not for comfort, but to delay decay. His breathing slowed, then paused, then returned with a tremble, like even death wasn't sure it wanted him yet. He coughed, a wet, hollow sound, and the men near him stepped back, not in fear, but in disgust. They had followed him for years, not out of love, but out of rank, now without the crown. He was just a man, a sick, pale, half-lucid body, waiting to be replaced. No one held his hand, no one spoke to ease him, no one said, "It's all right." Because it was, not for him, not for anyone. And this was the final irony. He had spent his life building walls, around himself, around his crown, around his guilt. Now, in his last moments, those walls became a coffin. He wasn't surrounded by enemies. He was surrounded by space, too much of it. Too wide between hearts, too quiet for a man who once roared across courtrooms. That silence. It wasn't peace, it was absence. I thought there'd be anger in me reading this, but there was just stillness, like watching something burn out slowly, after forgetting it was ever lit. And maybe that's the truth of John's final act. He didn't die a villain, he didn't die a king, he died the way people forget. Slowly, without witness, and too late to change anything. His heart gave out sometime near midnight, or maybe just stopped bothering. His soul, if you believe in such things, didn't rise. It rested right there, in that room, where no one cried, no one broke. When he died, the room didn't mourn, the kingdom didn't break, and the world just kept going. No pause, no reckoning, no attempt to understand the man who had once been called king. And maybe that's what frightened me most. Not the way he died, but how little it seemed to matter. Because power, real power, doesn't die with its owner. It seeps, it stains. It survives in the laws, the systems, the habits we forget to question. John lost battles. He lost trust. He lost himself, but even in failure, he left behind something unshakable. Not legacy, not admiration, but asterisk structure. The Magna Carta, a document he never believed in. A document he signed out of fear. A document he broke the moment the ink dried. And yet, that same document would outlive him by centuries. It would be copied, rewritten, whispered across revolutions. It would cross oceans, shape parliaments, become the backbone of the idea that even kings must answer to someone. That's the irony. He didn't mean to make history, but he did, not by his strength, but by his collapse. He became proof. That unchecked power devours itself. That fear can't govern forever. That a crown doesn't protect you from being forgotten, only delays it. And yet, I can't bring myself to hate him. Because somewhere in that fevered bed, covered in sweat and filth, there wasn't just a king failing to die well. There was a human being, cornered by a life he never truly controlled. Maybe that's the part we miss. When we study men like John, the cruelty, the corruption, it's all there, but so is the confusion, the hunger, the loneliness, the quiet belief that he was owed something better, even if he never earned it. That tension didn't die with him. It lingers in every institution that outlasts its purpose, in every leader who refuses to step down, in every system that forgets its people. So when I think of King John now, I don't think of the tyrant, or the coward, or even the dying man. I think of the silence after he was gone, and the way that silence didn't heal, it calcified. It became law, precedent, tradition, and we, centuries later, still live in its echo. Maybe the question isn't whether he deserved to die that way. Maybe the question is, what does it say about us? That we needed him too, that we needed his downfall to justify our reforms, his disgrace. I didn't set out to feel anything for King John, not pity, not respect, not even curiosity. He was always described as the worst of English kings. A failure, a tyrant, a man too selfish to rule and too weak to hold on. But when I read how he died, not just the illness, but the silence, the emptiness, the absence of grief, I felt something I didn't expect, recognition. Because his death wasn't about poison or peaches. It wasn't even about politics. It was about isolation, the kind that doesn't happen overnight, but accumulates over years, choice by choice, lie by lie, power held too tightly until there's no one left to hold asterisk you asterisk. And that made me pause, because you don't have to be a king to end up like that. You just have to forget that people are not tools, are not pawns, are not there to orbit your will. You just have to lose the ability to listen, to doubt yourself, to ask for help before it's too late. And the world won't always punish you with war. Sometimes it punishes you with indifference. I think that's the legacy we don't talk about. Not the Magna Carta, not the taxes, not the war, but the silence, the one that filled the room when John took his final breath. And no one cried, no one screamed, no one even flinched. And maybe that silence is still echoing in governments that rule through fear, in leaders who never learn to say, I was wrong, in people who confuse obedience with love. We look at history for heroes, but maybe its real value is in showing us who not to become. So no, you don't have to mourn King John. You don't even have to forgive him. But maybe, just maybe, You have to remember him, not as a king, not as a villain, but as a man who mistook control for connection and died wondering why no one